hope everybody is feeling energized now after our small exercise routine. So welcome to our first keynote session of the EARLI conference. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's keynote, Professor Manu Kapur, who's a professor at the Department of Humanities, Social and Political Sciences of the ETH in Zürich, where he holds the chair of Learning Sciences and Higher Education. Prior to joining ETH Zurich, Manu was a professor of psychological studies at the Education University of Hong Kong. He also worked as the head of the curriculum, teaching, and learning academic group, as well as the head of Learning Sciences Lab at the National Institute of Education in Singapore. An engineer by training, Manu Kapur was a pre-university mathematics teacher for 5 years before receiving his doctorate in instructional technology and media from Teachers College, Columbia University in New York, where he also completed a Master of Science in Applied Statistics. He also holds a Master of Education from the National Institute of Education. Early in his academic career, Manu Kapur directed a multi-million interactive and digital media research and development program at the Ministry of Education of Singapore to jumpstart research on interactive and digital media in education in Singapore. Manu conceptualized the notion of productive failure and has used it to explore the hidden efficacies in the seemingly failed efforts of small groups solving complex problems collaboratively in an online environment. Manu has done extensive work in real-field ecologies of mathematics classrooms to extend his work on productive failure across a range of schools in Singapore. His research has attracted high-profile media interest, such as the Time magazine, the Australian, the Straits Times, the Times of India, The Conversation, etc., and multi-million funding in Singapore and internationally. He has been invited to present major keynote addresses around the world, and his work has been published in top tier journals in the field. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Kapur to the podium, and I'm looking forward to hearing his talk about the powerful concept of productive failure. Manu, the floor is yours. Please.
Thank you, Elena. Can you hear me? Can you hear me loud and clear? No? Can we do something about it? I did switch it on, right? Can you hear me? Can you hear? Oh, okay, so I think it's... Can you hear me now? All right. Okay. Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you, Lena. It's amazing to be here. That was the keynote. Why are you guys still here? No, but I guess they knew something about embodied cognition, didn't they? Made us move, so I hope I'm not sure if it's a good thing whether you're now alive and listening, but I'm going to talk about productive failure. 12 years ago, or 13 years ago, I graduated out of, completed my PhD and wrote my thesis on productive failure, although at the time I hadn't called it productive failure. And little did I know that in 12 years or so, there'll be lots of people trying to replicate that work, extend that work, prove or falsify that work. And I'm sorry if I've ruined many a PhD student's lives with all the projects that you've had to do. But the good side of that is we've got now a number of studies on this phenomena, and that we can take stock of what the whole phenomena is, why it works and why it doesn't. So that's the focus of my talk, when productive failure fails. And I thought it would be consistent with the whole underlying philosophy of productive failure. If you're going to try and make learners intentionally fail at problem solving so that they can learn deeply from instruction later on, then it's all the more reason that the phenomena itself be subjected to a similar scrutiny. So the focus or the agenda for my talk is basically twofold. First, I'm going to describe briefly what productive failure is. Maybe not so brief. Maybe I have to go into details because having seen the body of research that's gone into it, productive failure could mean many things to many different people. So I want to spend the first half of the presentation talking about what exactly productive failure is as intended, and then discuss where it fails and how it fails. Okay? And this is critical because we want to disentangle the failure of PF, productive failure, versus the failure to design for fear. And this will come out hopefully as I go on with my talk. So let's start with what productive failure is. Nothing like a concrete example. Some of you may have already seen it. This is a classic example I always give. If that's the case, you can go back to your mobile phones. If not, you can listen on. All right, so imagine you're a high school student. You're learning statistics, and you're given a problem, a design challenge to solve. The design challenge goes something like that. There are 3 football strikers. Here are the number of goals they've scored in a year in the Premier League over a number of years. You haven't learned the concept yet, but before you even learn the concept, the teacher says, invent or generate as many solutions to decide who's the most consistent striker. What do you think students, in this case grade 8, 9 students, would do if they've never even heard the concept of, in this case it's standard deviation? What do you think they would do? Take the average.
They won't be interested in the question. They want to know who's the most productive, not the most consistent.
Right. Okay. That has never happened, but yes, they do question what do you mean by consistency, but yes, they could be. They could redefine it as most productive, and some of their solutions actually answer that. What else might they do? Range without calling it range, or maybe calling it range if they've learnt it. Yeah, looking at the maximum and the minimum values.
Make a histogram.
Make a histogram if they've done that in the curriculum before that. Yep, they could do that. These are all very textbook ideas. That exercise didn't do you any good, right? Come on, can we be a little bit more creative? More than averages, range, histograms. What else could they do? Think like a novice. Just from the first year to the last year, never mind maximum minus minimum. Yeah, maybe they could do that.
Find the biggest numbers.
Find the biggest numbers, the largest numbers, and do what with them? Like tally them?
Just count them.
Take the sum of all of them? Yep.
Find the most common number.
Most common.
The mode.
The most common.
Yeah.
The most frequent or common. Yeah, okay. The one that appears a lot. Yeah, like a mode. They know that. Yep.
Count the unique numbers.
Count the unique numbers, because that's a very interesting one. Now we're thinking like novices. Thank you. No, but that's important. You see, like, as experts, we go into when we teach, and I taught math for 5 years. We're so used to thinking like an expert and explaining what we have, and explaining it in nice ways to our students. Little do we realize. I mean, this community does, but oftentimes we don't realize how important it is to know what novice thinking is, activate that, and build on that. So I'm going to show you what students actually do, and we've done this with thousands of students, and the work has also shown similar patterns of results in other studies as well. So they do love to do totals and averages, and part of the way we've designed these problems is we know that they're going to use this knowledge to solve the problem, but then we've kept it invariant, so that they say, I'm going to use averages or totals, but all the averages and the totals are the same, so I've got to try something else. Okay? They do tallying, and when they're doing tallying on the top right, you can see they can say like the third player is either very good or very bad, and between the first two, the second player is more bunched up, more clustered around in the center, and that's more consistent. They can do frequency polygons, and when they do that, these are good ways of thinking about the problem. We say, well, can you be more precise? Can you quantify how you want to define consistency? They love to draw graphs, fever curves, fluctuation graphs, and this is years on the x-axis and number of goals on the y-axis. And if you ask students, what are you doing? They'll say, well, if it goes up and down a lot, it's more inconsistent. If it doesn't fluctuate so much, it's consistent. And I think that's a good way to think about the problem. But if you had 100 players, we say, would you do that 100 times? Can you be more precise? Can you quantify it? They love to take maximum minimum. That's another very frequently used solution that comes out. But again, the evil side of productive failure is that we keep it the same, right? We know they're going to use it, and if we know that they're going to use it, we keep it invariant so that they have to think of something else. And that's one of the principles of designing for productive failure that I will go into in a bit. A very intuitive solution that often comes out is what we call the year-on-year deviation or differences. They'll just take 1 year minus the previous year, and then they'll add all the differences up and say the total represents the total change in the data, and therefore the greater this value, the more inconsistent. Right? Some of them recognize that high fluctuations, positive and negative differences, tend to cancel, which is not fair. This is all student language, right? Which is not fair, so we must ignore the signs, just take the magnitude of the value. And if they take the magnitude of the value, the answer changes. Some of them go on to not only just take the magnitude of the value, but also take an average sense of the fluctuation in the graph. Again, and the answer changes based on that. So the idea here is, students go through these different solutions. They obviously are using what they've learned formally in the school, the idea of mean, median, mode, drawing graphs, range, and so on and so forth. But beyond that, the problem is not solvable using that. So it's implicitly designed for them to try other methods as well that activates their intuitive knowledge as well. And these are some examples of that knowledge being activated. And sometimes you get really creative solutions. Not that the others are not creative. This is an example that I particularly like. And there are many others like that. But this is quite instructive. And here is a group of students working on this problem. And when we pushed them to quantify the graph, they came up with a solution. They said, imagine you could hold the ends of the graph. Imagine you could somehow extend it into a rope. Next, imagine you could calculate the length of that rope. The longer the rope, the more inconsistent. And what they've done here, this is rather tedious, I'm not sure if you can make sense of it. They've divided the graph into 19, I believe, Pythagorean triangles. And using a squared plus b squared equals c squared, they've calculated the length of the hypotenuses. And they've added all of them up together. And they've actually calculated that number. And based on that, they can decide who's the most consistent. Now, to this day, I've never bothered to find out if that calculation is correct. And there's a reason for it. Now, the real mathematics is not in the calculation or the computation, because actually the computation is nonsense. You can't combine years with goals. Any mathematician would tell you that. But the real mathematics is in the idea, in the creativity, in the play of ideas. And this is all happening in 30 to 45 minutes, sometimes more, depending on the class period, before they've even learned the concept or have been introduced to the concept of how to solve the problem. Now imagine, once students have done this, it's a two-phase design. So once students have generated and explored multiple solutions because of the complex problems they've given them, we've got them in small groups and they're working together, and we don't give them any additional hint or support. We merely provide some affective support, like changing the culture of the classroom, telling them that we are just interested in their ideas and solutions, never mind if they're correct or incorrect. So they've generated a bunch of these solutions, 3, 4, 5, 6 solutions at a time, and then the teacher comes in and consolidates and assembles the knowledge. And that's the second phase, which is the consolidation. The teacher teaches and gives some minimal practice. Right? So productive failure then is a two-phase design which sort of combines, if you were to say, the benefits of exploration, constrained exploration, carefully designed exploration, not open-ended discovery. It's a very carefully designed exploration. I'll go into that, followed by consolidation and instruction. And the idea was that if you did this, that students would learn deeper, better procedural knowledge. No, maybe not, but at least conceptually their understanding would be better, and the ability to transfer that knowledge to novel situations would also be better than instruction first. So you get introduced to the concept of standard deviation or whatever the math concept you're learning, followed by problem solving. So even this is not enough of a specification that defines what productive failure is. So with my colleague, Kate Balachik, when I was still in Singapore at the time, and she was there too at the Learning Sciences Lab, we tried to specify how do you design for productive failure? What elements, if I were to go to a teacher and work with a teacher and say, this is how you need to design, this is what productive failure looks like, what could I say? What principles could I give the teacher or work with the teacher? So first you've got to design the activity, the task itself, the problem. How do you design that activity? So the principles for designing the activity. Productive failure is not about giving any task or any challenging question or a problem you can find. It's a particular way of designing, and I'll share with you. Then it's a way of another layer that surrounds activity takes part in some kind of interaction and participation. How do you design the participation, student interaction around that activity? What are the principles for that? So those need to be specified. Finally, the social surround. Nothing happens in a vacuum. It's a cultural practice, right? So if the norms of the classroom or the context within which productive failure is taking place are not consistent with the underlying philosophy, so what kinds of norms and expectations and values you need to put in place and constantly emphasize for something like productive failure to work. And so at each of the three layers have to be specified for each of the two phases of the design. So I'm going to give you an example of just the activity, the principles. So these are design principles for the activity, the task that you just saw. So in the generation phase, what is the task? So we say when we design productive failure tasks, they must have certain features. Here are some principles for embodying those features into these tasks. First, you've got to create an affective draw. We chose football problems. In your context, could be anything else, right? Create an affective draw that has an intuitive hook. So if I'm teaching you, if I want to teach you something on calculus or integration, I won't give you a problem on integration. I have to think, how can I get you to think about integration without integration in a way that is affectively engaging as well as it's intuitive enough. And that's where a designer of learning comes in, right? So that's one principle. Again, it's sufficiently open and there's lots of room for creativity. We want tasks or activities that admit multiple representations and solutions. So it could be the same solution in other representations, or it could be entirely different solutions. The task you saw is a perfect example of a task admitting multiple representations as well as solutions. What happens if you try a productive failure task in a classroom, you think it's a productive failure task, you've designed it so, and students only produce one or two solutions? Something must be wrong with the students because you've done your job, right? Well, that's not how we think in productive failure. We go back to the design and we say, can we tweak the design so that the next time we try, we get more solutions? Going back to the principles. As you saw, we use variant invariant features to bring about failure. Right? We don't want students to be able to solve the problem. So the question of productivity. If it kept the averages the same, some may argue, well, I want to think about productivity, and the person who has the highest average is not only more productive, but also more consistent. Now, arguments can and they're fine to come out, but as far as possible, we try and tweak the data itself if you're using data-driven design, or other cases where some things are similar and other things are kept different. And the idea is by focusing on these variant invariant features, you can get students to try what they activate their knowledge and make sure that the problem is not solvable by that knowledge. And because contrasting cases are involved, and that's one of the good ways of doing this, you can implicitly drive their attention to critical features in the distribution. So they're looking at the means, they're looking at the ends, they're looking at something is happening in between without really getting to the solution. But that's good enough. And that's the idea. And we want to keep computational load. So we want to use, if they need to compute, the computational load is kept as low as possible. And the final principle is you've got to iteratively calibrate. This is not something you get right on the first instance, because this whole cycle is the principles interact with where the learners are, with the knowledge that they have, with the practices that they're used to. And it has to be iteratively calibrated based on that. So that's just the generation phase, right? Phase 2 is the consolidation. So after this generation, the teacher has to come in. So teacher can't just do anything. We say, well, you've got to compare and contrast student solutions. So even though students produce multiple solutions, some of them may compare and contrast, but it may not happen naturally. So one of the jobs of consolidation is to do this contrast, because through the contrasts, you can focus on the critical features. If students have done it, you've got to direct attention to these features and discuss them, and then try to assemble these features into the canonical forms, the correct concepts. And so the idea is work with student knowledge, compare and contrast, identify critical features, assemble them into a canonical form. And once you've done that, then move on, right? So this is the principle for the activity, right? Similarly, we've got principles for the participation structure. In phase 1, students are collaborating, working in small groups, and how do you design those groups? So some set of principles there. I won't go into the detail. How do you facilitate, in consolidation, what does the teacher do with the whole class interaction? Okay? So that's another set of features that a teacher has to do at the participation structure. And finally, for the social surround. In the generation, you can't just go in, at least we advise not to go and just do productive failure. I was just talking this morning with one of my colleagues. He said he tried a productive failure problem in one school, and it worked wonderfully. In another school, when he tried, it didn't work out at all, because children were just completely not used to it. Okay? It could also be a function of ability, but the idea is the cultural practice of the classroom, the social surround within which this gets carried out is very important. Right? So you've got to set the right expectations, you've got to create the safe space, you've got to set the right expectations and norms and values, provide the affective support, and then focus on things like ideas improvement and building on students' solutions. Right? So, where does this work, productive failure, fall in the universe of all the other work that's happening in this genre? And I thought, once we have a concrete sense of what productive failure is, let's put this in the context of the overall body of work on problem solving in this genre. So we've got Shorts and Bransford notion of preparation for future learning. It's a very good idea, it's a brilliant idea. It's a very general idea as well, that, for example, if your students are coming to a lecture, you can ask them to read notes, you can ask them to watch a video, you can ask them to do an experiment, you can ask them to do a number of things as preparation for coming and learning from a lecture that you're going to give. And all this falls in this broad genre, the full genre, the broader category of preparing for future learning from instruction, I would add. Now, within this family of designs, you've got what Katharina Leubel, Roll, and Rummel called problem solving followed by instruction. So some of the preparatory activities involve problem solving, some kind of problem solving. Never mind what kind it is, but there's some problem solving involved. And that problem, the function of that problem solving is to prepare you to learn from instruction later on. And that's called PSI, PS-I. Okay? So that's problem solving. So there's the whole body of problem, PFL, then some preparatory activities are problem solving, and then within the problem solving, followed by instruction designs, sits productive failure, where the problem solving is designed to intentionally lead to suboptimal or incorrect solutions using the principles that I've just shared with you. So it's a smaller subset of even the PSI designs. So I hope that, because as I've read a lot of work over the last 10 years, last 12 years, productive failure is often confounded with many other things. So I found it useful to actually think about where productive failure begins and ends, and where other things are in relation to productive failure. Because I've started to read papers where problem solving followed by instruction or anything goes is productive failure as long as it precedes instruction. Right? So just to clarify that. Now, in the context of productive failure, the main finding that we have in several, and this is the bulk of my own work right now, and for the review you can consult that paper, In several quasi-experimental and controlled experimental studies, the main finding we found is that productive failure, which is like a PSI instruction, but based on productive failure principles, between productive failure and direct instruction, which I'm calling IPS, instruction followed by problem solving, there's no difference in terms of the basic procedural knowledge that you get, that you develop. So procedural knowledge development, how to calculate standard deviation, how to calculate ratios, or using ratios and standard deviation, or whatever the topic is, to solve basic problems, there's no difference. Both conditions come out really well in terms of the basic procedural knowledge. But productive failure tends to outperform direct instruction on conceptual understanding and transfer, the ability to transfer to novel situations. That's the basic finding that we have. Then you've got to start to think about, why does it happen the way it does? It's not, what are the underlying learning mechanisms? And I've been thinking about it with colleagues and others about all these mechanisms. So I'm going to give you the whole set of mechanisms that we've theorized. Not all of them are empirically validated, but some of them are. At the cognitive level, there's obviously activation, prior knowledge, activation of prior knowledge. But prior knowledge in the sense not just formal knowledge, but also informal, intuitive knowledge. Comparing and contrasting is helping students notice what is critical, what is not. Katharina Leubel and colleagues did excellent work on awareness of gaps. So when they generate these solutions, there's an awareness, there's a gap between what they're generating versus a correct or some correct solutions. The selection mechanisms are fine-tuning, so they know what is it. Not only they're able to see what is incorrect or suboptimal and separate, discriminate that from what is optimal and correct, but also understand why. And also mental effort, and the flip side of that, cognitive load. Load is high in these situations. So when I speak of mental effort, I speak of it in the sense of, in the Vygotskian sense, where a certain amount is necessary for you to be in that zone. Too little or too much is bad, right? And I'll discuss how this is different, similar or different to the cognitive load theory interpretation of things. But let's move on. There's also affective mechanisms. We found that situational interest peaks. So if you ask students just before consolidation, how much do you really want, how interested are you in finding out the solution? Compared to people who are instructed first, there's a very big difference in the interest. The goal, some researchers also found the goal orientation is different. So having generated these solutions, their orientation towards the lecture in terms of how they want to master the concept, really understand why it is the way it is, that's different. And persisting through struggle and frustration, children need to learn how to do that. It is not something that comes naturally. Some, like I said, in some classrooms, in some schools, it is entirely not the culture for this to happen. So as we work slowly to change the classroom culture in practice, we get students to persist through struggle and frustration. Because students are working in small groups, there are social mechanisms at work, and also social costs, obviously. But the explanation and elaboration, they're building shared representations because they don't even have a formal language yet to talk about some of these phenomena. They're benefiting from multiple perspectives and vicariously learning through their peers as well. Cultural mechanisms. Like I said, you can't do this in a vacuum. So the more the teacher emphasizes the role of failure, the failure is normative, the ideas are important, you need to put in the effort and improve the ideas. And the idea of disciplinarity. It's like if you're learning math or science, it's not just learning about the math or the science, it's learning to be like a mathematician and like a scientist. So engaging in the disciplinary practices of the domain itself. And a more recent area is embodied mechanisms. So a lot of times when you observe students in these activities, before learning the concept, they're using a lot of spontaneous gestures to explain these concepts. So it's bunched up, it's spread out, you know, it's fluctuating a lot. So there's a lot of these embodied mechanisms at play. They're using a lot of metaphors as well, as I showed you. And again, these have a role to anchor this initial learning process as well, before they learn from instruction. So these are the sets of mechanisms. Like I said, some of them have a strong basis in empirical research, and others don't. And in about 2016, there was a very nice review paper. The evidence was mounting. There were about 20 studies that were reviewed by, I mentioned this paper already, Leubel, Roll, and Rummel. And they reviewed this whole body of literature to understand when and how problem solving before instruction works. So it was the bigger category, not just productive failure. Like I said, there were about 20 studies, and of all the mechanisms, their model was something like that. You start with a certain prior knowledge. The first mechanism is prior knowledge activation. As far as it's relevant prior knowledge activation, that leads to an awareness of gaps. You know, the student realizes that there's something that he or she does not know. And when you compare and contrast solutions, students get to notice deep feature recognition, or what I call attention to critical features previously. And when the explicit instruction and consolidation comes in, the whole thing could be assembled into a knowledge structure that students understand, and they can transfer that knowledge to novel situations. So that was a very timely review about 3 years ago. Around about the same time, I did more of a theoretical review, looking at different aspects of learning versus performance. And here, borrowing from Bjork and Short's, Schmidt and Bjork, notion of desirable difficulties, they disambiguated the difference between learning and performance. So sometimes you have a case where performance can be low or high, and learning could be low and high. So in the case of pure discovery learning, for example, people go on wild goose chases, they don't learn much. It could be a case of unproductive failure. Not much performance, not much learning. Sometimes in the initial exploration, if it's carefully designed for, it's constrained to focus on relevant knowledge, you can have low performance in the sense that students are not getting to the correct solutions, but there's deep learning going on. That's what I call productive failure. At times, both performance and learning could be aligned, in the sense that you have a problem, you're learning through the problem solving itself. For example, if problem-based learning is carried out well, then it could be a case where both performance and learning are aligned very well, and you get productive success. And unproductive success is the illusion of learning in high performance. And in this paper, I made the case that if you compare direct instruction to discovery learning, direct instruction could very well look like productive success. But given the evidence that's mounting over a number of studies in PSI and productive failure designs, it could also be a case of unproductive success, because there is an illusion of learning in high performance. And I unpacked some of the implications for research on learning, especially from a cognitive load standpoint. And I'll get to that. Okay? So that's where we were at around 3 years ago. There's been a lot of work since then. A number of studies have come out. And when I got to Zurich, and within a couple of years after that, we started asking this question. Now that a number of studies come up, can we start asking this question about when does it fail? We also already started having some initial experiments where things were not, the evidence was not in the predicted direction. So we started to look at, okay, can we systematically review the state of the art right now and find out where does it start to break down? What are the boundary conditions? Now, instead of looking at it study by study, we wanted to do a meta-analysis, and this is something that I'm still carrying out with my doctoral student, Tanmay. We recently published a paper in the CogSci proceedings, just recently in Montreal. But this paper is a qualitative synthetic review, and since then we've carried out a more quantitative meta-analysis, and that's something that I'll share with you now. Right, so very briefly, the search criteria was we used Google Scholar database. As of 26th of June, which is more than a month ago, this is the status right now. So I'm giving you something that is, you can say, very recent. We looked for all papers that had cited the seminal work on productive failure or the follow-up work on productive failure, and one way or the other. They might not be productive failure studies, but they had to have cited that. And we weren't looking for qualitative descriptions. We focused entirely on either controlled experiments and quasi-experimental work. For those of you familiar with the field, the earlier work on productive failure was largely quasi-experimental. thanks to me. But since then, there's a lot of control experimental work that's also gone on. So we combined those two studies. Now, just these two criteria alone resulted in over 1,200 papers. That just blew my mind, the damage that been done. Right? That just blew my mind, like 1,200 papers. Okay. Then we wanted to look at specific comparisons. So in the studies, we wanted to look at the middle category, problem solving followed by instruction designs that compare that with instruction followed by problem solving. Okay, we wanted to look at that comparison. So studies had to have at least this as part of their comparison. Or they must compare problem solving followed by instruction with what is called plus PS, which basically means you provide some cognitive or metacognitive support during the problem solving. Because a lot of times in the past, when we left productive failure problem solving, the first phase, unscaffolded in that sense, no cognitive guidance, people said, well, if you're achieving positive effects without guidance, might you not achieve more if you guide them? So this is the body of literature, problem solving preceding instruction, where some form of guidance at the cognitive or the metacognitive level is given to students. And the third is that the preparatory activity, which is the preparation for future learning, is not problem solving at all. So not if those of you who are algorithmically inclined would notice that the exclamation mark before the thing means not PS, right? So the preparatory activity could be studying a worked example or watching a video or reading notes and so on and so forth. So there were 3 comparisons that we obtained from these studies. And all of this came down to, that sort of whittled down once we looked at conceptual knowledge and transfer. So the studies had to have compared outcomes on conceptual understanding and transfer. So not just procedural knowledge, it had to have conceptual understanding and transfer. So the 1,200 papers came down to basically 250 experimental comparisons in 78 different experiments spanning 62 articles. So the rest of it, of what I'm going to share with you, is based on these 250 comparisons between PSI versus other conditions, as listed there. Then because PSI is a broader category, as I said, not all problem solving is productive failure or designed according to productive failure principles, we invented a coding to do a fidelity check. Now, if you do a fidelity check with the entire set of principles that I described, that information is almost never available in any article. So we had to choose, like almost iteratively choose, what is the best middle ground? How can we tell from how people are describing their PSI design, how can we best tell whether they're following productive failure principles? So these are the 5 criteria that we could discern from how the articles were written. So A, were they using complex problems that afforded multiple solutions and representations? That was one, because usually the tasks are given in the articles. Are they providing evidence that students are actually generating multiple solutions? It's not sufficient to have the task. You've got to show that students don't just do one thing and stop. They need to generate multiple, because that's the activation mechanism. Does the problem, as you read it, provide an affective draw, potentially, to the students? Are they getting students to collaborate in the initial phase? And finally, the instruction, as described in the paper, does it build on student solutions, or is it independent of it? Right? So each criteria, we just do a very blunt coding system, gave it a point. So a study could receive 0 points. That means it's problem solving before instruction, but it has nothing to do with productive failure, as far as fidelity is concerned. Or you could have full 5 points. That means this is very close to the productive failure principles, although not the entire set that we described. Okay? So studies could get 0 and 5 points. So that's what we did. A bit more in terms of geography, the papers, I'll come back to the fidelity in a bit. In terms of geography, the papers were largely from North America, about 50%, half of them were from North America. Asia and Europe were roughly the same, about 23%, and Australia about 7%. That was the geographical distribution. Age group was also a healthy distribution. Younger kids, 2nd to 5th graders, about 12% of the paper, 13% of the papers. The bulk of the work was in middle school and high school, 6th to 10th graders. Undergraduates, a third of it. and others postgraduates and professionals. So it was spread across the age range as well, sufficiently manifest in each category, perhaps with the exception of others, the older population. Across the domains, it was, if you can see, yep, a lot of work in mathematics, more than half of it, a lot of work in science, medicine, so both domain-specific STEM domains, as well as domain-general work like Rubik's Cube, control of variable strategy learning, Tower of Hanoi, and those kinds of problems as well. Okay, and some work in social sciences as well, psychology and social sciences, but very like just about 3%. So that's the distribution of the where the work's been carried out in the world, at what age group, and the domains in which these comparisons, the 250 comparisons, we're looking at. So we wanted to find out if you pool all the effect sizes and you compare the three conditions. You have the PSI condition, problem solving followed by instruction. If you compare this with instruction first, followed by problem solving, or any of the other two conditions that we said, what on average is the effect size in favor of PSI? Okay, this is what we got. So the first row gives you all the 250 comparisons, and you can see the effect size is about 0.25. This is Hedges G, which is a better pooled estimate than Cohen's D. And you can see the confidence intervals as well. So it's about 0.25 of an effect size in favor of problem solving preceding instruction over 250 comparisons. Of the 250 comparisons, 166 of them were with IPS, so instruction followed by problem solving. And here you can see that the effect size is around 0.34. So medium to moderate range. And the confidence interval is also healthy, 0.2 to 0.45, and significant. Okay? When problem solving followed by instruction was compared with supported problem solving, the third row, plus PSI, there was no difference. So the marginal benefit of supporting students through problem solving preceding instruction was not there. At least we didn't see an average effect. Okay? And comparing problem solving followed by instruction with the general class of preparatory activities was also not significant, although the effect size was around 0.19, 0.2, which is a low effect size, small effect size. So maybe it's a sampling problem, the numbers are not enough. We only have 48 comparisons there. Okay? But what this is showing us is, on average, there is an effect in favor of PSI when compared to IPS. And that effect is significant, and it's between 0.22 to 0.45, the 95% confidence interval. That's the second row that I'm talking about. Then we did some subgroup analysis. We can look at incoming characteristics. It would have been nice to have a lot of incoming characteristics variable information, but unfortunately we did not have that much. We looked at age group and geography. We looked at targeted domain. So do the effects vary if you're learning different things like math, science, so on and so forth. Of course, I described a bit of the fidelity to PF. We looked at, do the effects vary if the fidelity to PF is different, or does it not matter? And we looked at, do the effects vary whether you're measuring outcomes and conceptual understanding or transfer? Is there any difference? Now, there isn't enough time to do all of them, so I'm going to focus on a few, but I'm going to give you some snippets about geography. It's very interesting that the effects in Asia and Australia are a lot higher than in Asia, in Europe and North America. So again, we haven't unpacked that. I don't know why that happens. There are lots of reasons, but the PSI, the effect of PSI over IPS in Asia and Australia are a lot greater than in, for example, the comparisons made in Europe and North America. They're still significant, but not the effect sizes are stronger. So that's intriguing finding. In terms of the targeted domain, it seems that domain-specific content, math, science, STEM domains, the effects are stronger. But when you move to domain general skills, like CVS, general problem-solving strategies, the effect is not there. So that's sort of interesting as well. When it comes to learning outcomes, there is no effect of separate learning outcomes. So conceptual, whether you're measuring outcomes in terms of conceptual understanding or transfer, there is no difference there's no variation in the effects that would be significant. So that leaves us age group and fidelity as the two things that we want to focus a little bit more on. So we asked this question: what is the effect of PF by age group? Because you have different, many studies at each age group, and this is what we got. So on the x-axis, you have the 4 different age groups. So 1 means the 2nd to 5th graders, 2 means 6th to 10th graders, 3 means undergraduates, and 4 are postgraduates and professionals. And on the y-axis, you have the treatment effect, the standardized mean differences, the Hedges G, basically. Right? As you can see, the line is flat because there are quite a few extreme values. So the y-axis runs from -2 to 4 because of some of the values. But actually, if you run the model, what you find is that for each, as you go through the 4 age categories, as you jump across the categories, the Hedges G increases by 0.11. So it seems like the older students benefit more from PSI. The effect of problem solving followed by instruction is greater for older students than it is for younger students when you compare it with instruction first. So that's the trend that we're finding. Okay, so that's one interesting case, because if you look at the younger population, all the treatment effects are roughly clustered around 0. But it sort of increases as it goes along. Then we looked at fidelity. So let me give you an example of the concrete example of how the fidelity was carried out, just by giving a couple of examples from the literature. So here's an example of 2 studies that we coded as low on fidelity. So you can look at the 5 factors, the criteria, and we looked for presence and absence of these factors inside the papers. And the first study is coming at 1 point, and the second study has only 2 matching criteria. You can look at that Hedges G is negative, -0.97 and -0.48. So when the fidelity is low to PF, instruction first does better, and by a lot. Okay? This is just 2 studies that I'm giving you a flavor of. Equally, when we look at studies that have high fidelity to PF, so like the Lobel and Rummel paper in 2014, and there are many others too, and the Jacobson paper 2017, 4 and 5 points, and you can see when the problem-solving activity in the PSI design has high fidelity to productive failure, the effects are very large, 1.3 and 0.91, 0.92. Okay? How does it look like for the entire set of comparisons? So we again did something like that. So you can see 0 fidelity, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So order of increasing fidelity, and all the studies, the mean treatment effects on the y-axis. Again, because of extreme values, the line looks flat, but if you calculate the model, for each unit increase in the fidelity of problem-solving activity to PF, there is an effect size increase of 0.15. Which is, I think, a very good finding. It's a very decent way to say problem solving followed by instruction can be effective compared to instruction followed by problem solving, but when it's particularly aligned with high fidelity to PF, it is particularly effective. So, what does this tell us about when does productive failure fail? Well, it tells us two things, at least right now. With younger students, it might not be the best thing to do. There could be a number of reasons why, but this trend is something that we're finding across a number of studies now, as far as this meta-analysis shows. And another time where productive failure fails, but obviously when the fidelity to productive failure itself is low. There are alternative explanations. There are individual differences that we have no information on throughout this entire review. I mean, I have information from the studies that I've done. Other people may also have information from their studies, but individual differences will definitely come into play, why some people learn, some people not. Cultural context and norms, like the example I gave you earlier. There are some schools and classrooms where you can do this from day one, but you try the same activity in another classroom or a school, it just doesn't work. Right? So there are other reasons why productive failure fails as well. Right? So, just to summarize, Is problem solving followed by instruction always better than IPS, instruction followed by problem? Should we start with problem solving or should we start with instruction? Is it always the case that one is better than the other? Obviously not. Over 250 comparisons, or in this case 166 experimental comparisons, the average effect is strong, is moderate, medium to small to moderate. It's like I showed you, the confidence interval was between 0.22 and 0.45. So there is something to be said about starting with problem solving followed by instruction. Right? And what I wanted to emphasize, while we went looking for ways or studies where productive failure would fail, we found that it's actually either the younger children or the fidelity to PF that is the main criteria that decides whether it succeeds or fails. Right, I'm coming to an end, but we must talk about cognitive load theory as well. Right? So some of the issues that I've been thinking about, also I've written about, and the question here is, as designed, if you put on the hat of a cognitive load theorist, you would find that the cognitive load is very high in productive failure. I've actually measured it in my studies. The mental effort and cognitive load is indeed high. So how, compared to direct instruction. So how is it a condition where the mental effort, the cognitive load is so high, doing better than another condition where the cognitive load is lower? So there are some, I think, problematic aspects that we need to consider. There are a couple of assumptions in the CLT that I find we need to discuss. One is the monotonicity between learning and cognitive load, the assumption, so to speak, that lower the load, the better the learning because of the working memory, managing the working memory capacity. And the second one is simply the cognitive load is but one mechanism. As I showed you, there are many mechanisms, the confluence of many mechanisms, interdependent mechanisms that provide the effect. So just looking at cognitive load is just one mechanism. I was trained as an engineer, and the analogy I would give is this. We're trained to design, and then optimize. And optimization happens on multiple parameters. Right? As a learning scientist, well, I'm not doing something very different. I design, and then I try to optimize it based on different contexts as well. And the analog in engineering is, it's like you find yourself, I'm not saying this because I'm in Switzerland now, but you find yourself in the middle of a mountain range, for example, and you were searching for the lowest valley. And you reach a valley, and you find yourself, oh, this is great, but maybe I should search another valley. Then you time yourself out and go to another valley. Maybe this is deeper, maybe it's not. Then you find a third valley, or you go back to the original valley. The idea is you search for, that's the optimization across in a multivariate space. You're searching for a deeper valley in a mountain range. Now, when you're optimizing over multiple parameters, you would never know where is the exact deep valley. But if you focus on one parameter, it's very easy to find one value and settle in it. And I think that's one of the problems when you think about when we're only designing to optimize cognitive load. But there's also recent work that is looking at, in relation to cognitive load, issues of element interactivity. This is the work of Kalyuga and colleagues, and the role of prior knowledge. And the idea is that in some of the experiments, they found that element interactivity can explain the differential effects of problem solving followed by instruction. So the claim here is that when element interactivity is high, that means, let me give you an example. So 2 plus 2 is 4. If you're in the same dimension, it's 4, yes. But it's simple, right? You just have to remember number system, number rules, and you need to know what the plus sign is and what the equivalent sign is, and so on. The elements are not that great. The element interactivity is low. People can do the solve. Well, what if I give you this? You might have seen this recently, right? Now, again, whether you think the answer is 1 or 16, we'll leave it to you. But the point is, in this case, you've got to think of a lot more than just 2 plus 2. There are several more elements in the picture. There's interactions between the elements. So this is something of higher element interactivity. And the claim that they make is that productive failure is better when element interactivity is low, and not so much when element interactivity is high. But element interactivity itself is quite problematic because I mean, if you look at productive failure to begin with, the way we design these problems, they are of high element interactivity to begin with. So that alone cannot explain the phenomena. Second, if you look at a question like this, if I asked you, what is the standard deviation of this data set? 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. Now, is this something of high element interactivity or low element interactivity? If there's anyone here who's actually calculating the formula, it is high element interactivity for you, because you have to recognize all the symbols and actually do the thing, operation, right? So against your prior knowledge, it is something that is of higher element interactivity. But if you really understand the question and the underlying concept, you can say there is no variation, it should be 0. Right? And then in that case, compared to what you know, it becomes something of lower element interactivity. And somehow you can use productive failure with this. So the idea is, within the cognitive load framework, the way load works is it's not a capacity of the working memory, it's an interaction between the working memory and the long-term memory. So one way to think about PSI or productive failure design in particular, if you can activate knowledge in the long-term memory, relevant knowledge, and bring it to bear to solve problems, you can manage the working memory load. And that is why even having a slightly higher load in productive failure still works, because what you're doing is you're increasing the activation in the long-term memory. That helps you solve the problem that on the surface of it can look as something that has very high element interactivity. But again, it's an open area for research. There are multiple explanations, and one of the reasons why we want to investigate this is, we need to wear each other's hats and think about what makes for good research. Some future directions. There's one open problem that I would love to be able to solve, which is when you look at problem solving prior to instruction, we still do not know whether failure is sufficient or necessary. And so some of the work that I'm doing right now, together with my doctoral students, actually investigates this question more deeply. As I said, we have empirical evidence for some of the mechanisms, but not a whole lot of them. So we need to look at research that enhances or builds the explanatory basis of all the sets of mechanisms, including the embodied mechanisms. And I'm committed to interrogating the boundary conditions. So by all means, please try and make PF and PSI fail, because that's when we will learn the most about where the boundary conditions are. So now I go back to the day or the year that I graduated, and I think back of all the work and how I've tried to make a commitment to this line of research, how you do your first experiments. I remember sending my first paper out and basically got rejected, and the editor basically said, come back when you have something more interesting. That's fine. It happens a lot, by the way, okay? And that's fine. That's good. It pushes you to think, right? And over the years, you do multiple experiments, sometimes inspired by the reviews you get, the ideas that you get from your peers and also your critics, and you build a program of research. And then when you publish it, it often seems as though it's something that is very nicely thought out, when in fact it's not. A lot of sense-making happens. Of course, it goes into the studies, no doubt, but also after the fact and across a multiple time scale. So I've been thinking about, how do I think about this science at this juncture, the science of learning, building a science at this juncture. And I got reminded of this TV series that I used to watch. It's an English comedy series called Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister. So if you know, you know. If you don't, well, that's your problem. But there was a Mr. Humphrey in that, and in a Humphrey-esque notion, this is what I started to think about science, building this entire argument. So science is an argument. It's often nonlinear, where, to borrow Humphrey, in the fullness of time, one might be able to, under certain conditions and contexts, with certain groups of people and some tasks in certain domains for some goals, show that something holds, only to find that under other circumstances, something exactly holds as well. Right? And that is the state of research that has happened over the past 10 years. And I think it will continue, and I think it's a healthy thing as long as we keep sort of talking to each other, right? So, and as a final thought, I think it's great to have good support, and especially for doctoral students and postdocs here. It's great to have support of your colleagues and peers as you're building these arguments, these programs of research, but there's nothing like having a good enemy, a good critic. All right, with that, I thank you, and we're open to questions. So, you had a question over there? Sorry, there. Sorry, hi. Is it?
Hi. Thank you, Manu. That was really great. Always great. Enlightening. I think I might have missed this, but did you find a relationship between low fidelity and lower grades? Is there a relationship there? Low fidelity of PSI and lower grade. There's a relationship there.
No, we haven't looked at that. We haven't looked at the interaction yet.
Okay.
But this is ongoing analysis, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some real implications for the training of teachers, right? Because we know that the lower grades are, teachers don't really have, first of all, they have significant beliefs that we have to work with, as well as their skills, particularly in STEM. So I think it would be interesting to see if there's an interactional effect between those.
Definitely one of the things, yeah. Thank you.
I'm here?
Yeah.
Just a very brief question. How many of the 166 studies have been RCTs, so randomized control trials?
I don't have the number offhand, but I can give it to you. But I can say historically, I would say most of them are. Yeah. Because a lot of the earlier work in PSI was quasi-experimental, thanks, like I said, to me. The bulk of the work that's happening now is mostly randomized control. But even within that, we can argue about whether it's completely controlled, whether it's ecologically valid, so there are all those issues that we can keep talking about. But I think 166 is a decent number, even for a healthy split between quasi and controlled experiments. For example, we could also look at just how the pattern is by separating quasi with completely controlled environments. But then the sample size starts to become very small. So there are some limitations in how you compare that.
Okay. Yeah. Look here. Here.
See, that's what happens when an expert gives a lecture to a novice. Look here. Sorry.
So, thank you very much for an interesting talk, and mainly also for your very recent meta-analysis. You have put age as a core factor there in your interpretation of your data. What you showed on the graphic was that there's a great distribution over the age levels also. Yep. And so my question is, did you have a look at level of expertise or prior knowledge? Because I think the age factor might be confound with the level of expertise factor.
Yeah, so now that we know that age group matters, we will start to look at the difference, like the interaction between...
Are you sure that age group matters and that it's not confound with...
Maybe it is, so, but that analysis would show us, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, to the other end, I got the microphone here.
Okay, there.
So I have a question about the fidelity analysis. You had 5 different criteria, and the overall fidelity influenced results with higher efficacy. Did you identify that some criteria are more critical for the successful than some others?
We are doing that, because you can ask, like, if you give them each, it's like a discriminant analysis, right? You can say, it's equal weightage right now, but you turn the question on its head and said, what linear combination of the criteria maximally separates effects? We were planning to do that, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Right next to
Yes?
Okay, sorry.
Yeah?
1 and 2. I'll come to you after him, right?
Okay.
Thank you for a very, very nice presentation. I really enjoyed it. But much of my research is in cognitive load theory.
Thank you.
And what is not clear to me is why you are making a straw man of cognitive load theory by claiming that cognitive load theory assumes that better learning corresponds with lower load. If you really think that that is at the heart of cognitive load theory, you do not understand cognitive load theory. In cognitive load theory, we claim that we should make sure that learners' activities are aimed at learning. So the main claim of cognitive load theory is that we should promote germane processing within the limits of working memory. That has nothing to do with lowering cognitive load. It has to do with optimizing cognitive load. And I think that productive failure is a very interesting concept that we can also study within cognitive load theory, because it has everything to do with promoting students to do activities that relate to learning. So it has everything to do with promoting germane processing. So I don't understand why you feel the need to make a distinction, make a contrast, that I don't see it.
Yeah, so great point, thank you. In the review paper that I wrote in the Educational Psychologist in 2016, I make precisely the point that productive failure is not necessarily inconsistent with cognitive load theory, provided we have the view that working memory capacity can be managed by activating the long-term resources.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly the argument that I made, right? The reason why one has to go after lower the load, the monotonic relationship, A, it's been, I think John Swaller has said it, and B, there is still the argument to make that you should not start with problem solving after, followed by instruction. Because the load is lower in direct instruction first.
I've written the 2 review articles with John and Fred, and in neither the 98 article nor in the 2018 article or 19 article, we claim that there is a monoticity between learning and cognitive load. So if you are referring to the main review articles on cognitive load theory, there is no monoticity between cognitive load and learning.
Even if I grant you that, because you still have to explain why you would argue for instruction first as the because that's the lower load condition, right? Even if I grant you that, you still can't explain why the argument has to go forward.
The very first studies in cognitive load theory were on free effect.
Goal-free effect,
on
yes.
Asking students to explore rather than solve the problem. And I see a lot of relationships between between productive failure and goal-free problem solving. So you are really searching for contrasts that are not there. And I think it's much more productive for us to see how your findings can be incorporated in cognitive load theory and how cognitive load theory can incorporate findings on productive failure, rather than making a distinction that is not there. And by claiming a kind of relationship by cognitive load and learning that has never been presented as such in the literature, at least not by me, John Sweller and Fred Paas.
Okay. I agree on the second part, definitely.
Okay.
Yep.
Let's discuss this further with the drink.
I think there was a gentleman there, yeah.
You mentioned that you had looked at studies that had outcome variables that were conceptual and transfer. Could you describe more about the nature of the transfer and what the effects might be there slightly differently than just the conceptual learning?
So conceptual understanding items would be things like, you know, if you give them a buggy solution or incorrect solution, can they explain why it is incorrect? Or if you, when people calculate a ratio of, say, let's stick to the problem of standard deviation. You know, if you ask students, okay, why do you square the deviations when you calculate standard deviation? So it's an understanding of why the thing is formulated the way it is, rather than, and then being able to do something with it. So that's conceptual understanding. Or conceptual understanding is also the kind of item that I showed you. If I give you a data set 1, 2, 3, 4, and 11, 12, 13, 14, and ask you which one has a greater standard deviation, do you use a procedural basis to solve the problem, or do you understand it enough that you can actually tell me the answer right away? Okay, so that's the nature of conceptual understanding items, and we've developed different categories of conceptual items. And again, it's all in the papers. And second is the transfer items are, again, in the context of this study, we focus on problems where students need to normalize things. So they have to use standard deviation, but they have to normalize things. So asking a question like, is Michael Phelps a better champion than Roger Federer, or something like that? So you have the distribution, but you have to use standard deviation, but it is not a concept that you've learned. So you really have to solve that novel situation. So that's a transfer kind of a situation.
And are the effect sizes at all different between the two kinds of outcomes?
Yes, usually the concept, if I just speak to my work, I think the effect sizes are greater in transfer than conceptual understanding. But what we found here was across the range of studies, there was no difference in the effect of PSI versus IPS. Whether you looked at conceptual understanding or transfer, there was no significant difference.
Thank you.
Here, down here. I was wondering if you think that language has any role on the effect of productive failure on conceptual understanding. Language, I mean the language students use when solving the problem. Because I read your research from the literature on argumentation, and for me it's, the conditions you described as relevant conditions for a productive failure are precisely the conditions for a productive argumentation in collaborative settings. So I don't know, how do you see the relationship between your data, your research, and all the research on the field of argumentation and learning? And if you think that language is important, because I really think your research is very interesting, but the theoretical explanation you give, it's, I don't know, for me it's not so interesting. That's, I mean,
no, that's
sorry.
fine. So we used to, this is great. We used to thinking about the theoretical explanations based on our own training, right? So like I'm used to thinking of it in terms of mechanisms at different levels, and same for cognitive load, and that's another hat, and I can explain productive failure using that. And perhaps you see similarities and you can explain productive failure through an entirely different lens, and that's all fine. I do not know how to respond to that, maybe, but one thing could be said, that if there is a more parsimonious, for example, account, how you define parsimony would also be contestable then, but I make no claim that there is only one explanatory basis to a phenomena, especially in something as complex as learning, right? But if you can take this data, you can take the evidence and build a better account for it, then by all means one should do that.
Yeah, and coming back to the language question, have you think about it? Is it really, do you think it matters?
So the connection that I see, the bridge, is when students start to say that they feel like mathematicians. So the thinking and arguing or collaborating, talking like mathematicians do, and I think that's where they're being enculturated into the practice of mathematics, and language becomes a very important part, whether it's the formal language or the intuitive language. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. Also, it's a function of my ignorance with that literature. Thanks.
Over here. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I would have a question from a bit more of a practical side of you. How would you suggest of starting to use productive failure with students who do not have any prior knowledge of that or any prior experiences with that? Let me elaborate this. You would think that maybe even that like low fidelity approach might lead to better results with those students, because taking little steps, taking just one part of the approach first and then get used to that, and only then apply all the 5 principles might lead to better results.
Great question. So, the issue of prior knowledge, I really see it as a design issue.
And not just prior knowledge, but prior experiences of productive failure.
Yeah. So prior experiences, with the cultural context and the practices of what they're used to are very different from what this assumes, then yes, you've got to take it slow, right? But you've got to emphasize, because once the social surround starts to change, that's when you can do more and more. You can do different things in the same classroom. So that, I definitely agree. The issue of designing when students have no prior knowledge, I grant the fact that there could be situations where that is the case. Definitely. For example, in multi-level scientific phenomena, you really can't see the microdynamics of the situation. So there are cases where students really don't have the prior knowledge. But also, there are many times in my experience when I've worked with teachers, when teachers say, students really do not know anything about this. And I've turned it as a design issue to argue, no, if you design the problem in this intuitive way, completely differently, then they are engaging in ideas that are relevant to understanding this thing. And we've done it in abstract mathematics like algebra, like calculus, thinking about the infinitesimal and things like that. So I'm fairly quietly confident that it's a very rare situation where you would really be able to say, in this case, students really don't have any prior, they may not have any formal knowledge, but they do have resources to think with. And the art and science of design is to activate those resources. Yes.
Thank you, interesting presentation. I want to ask about the application this idea in real educational practices. Real educational school practices, my question relating. And actually, for example, and your seminal paper proposed that SD instructions about the 3 and 4 hours for SD, concept of SD. If we propose to the teacher in school, some teacher may say, it is very difficult, one concept take 3 or 4 hours. So because every day so many concepts I need to teach in the school, so that so it might be very difficult to use this instructional methodology, every concept I think, so that your idea about it. And another point I want to ask you, and for example, actually I'm a Japanese school, so Japanese school sometimes already knows before coming the classroom. For example, in the one case, one concept, for example, SD, even new in the classroom, but 60 or 70% of students already know in such situations, a bit hard to apply this one. So in such case, firstly instruct, and after that, next step then in solving a higher level kind of productive failure might be very effective. Like SD is a little bit highly influenced by the extreme value or something like that. Those kind of things that students think after knowing the basic concept is a little bit more, reaching to the higher level, I feel. So what do you think about those ideas?
Yeah, so on the second point about whether students already know, that's a calibration issue. There's no point designing a productive failure activity or lesson based on things that students already know. So you're right, you've got to find out what is it that they still do not know and design it based on that. Okay, so that's the part of calibration. So if you give the activity, everybody can solve it successfully, it's just not a good, at least not a good productive failure activity. Now, the issue of time. Yes, the initial implementations were very long because of trying different things in the classrooms. We're also experimenting with different design features. But right now we are at a point where you can do these preparatory activities from anywhere between 20 minutes to an hour, right? And we also say that you don't have to do it for all the concepts if you don't have time. I think students will also get disinterested after a while, I think. But if you're teaching a course, a term or a semester of 10, 12, 15 weeks, there could be 4 or 5 big ideas in your curriculum that you want students to really, really understand. And can you find 4 or 5 hours of half that, so 3 to 4 hours in that entire time in service of deeper understanding and transfer? that's a question only you can answer as a teacher. Yeah.
Hi. We have a problem in the Netherlands with student dropouts. It's very important to get students engaged from the beginning of their studies. Have you got any findings about using production failure as a means of engagement at the beginning of students' career in higher education?
No, I don't.
Would it be interesting to use it as a means of engaging students?
The closest I can come is in Singapore. At grade 6, there's a national exam called the Primary School Leaving Examination. And I think based on how you perform on this exam, you go to different schools. And there is a particular group of students who fail this exam, right? And some of them even failed twice. And so in Singapore, we have a special school for that. And we've tried there are actually a couple of schools for that. And we worked in those schools to use productive failure in mathematics, and we've shown that it works really well too. Again, it's a question. Like every time we work with teachers, I have to work at not thinking of performance as a function of ability per se only, but as an interaction between what you design and ability and knowledge, right? So when you start to think of that way, you are able to design for productive failure, even with students who have low knowledge. It's how you design it. So that's the closest I can come. Nothing with higher education so far. Yeah.
I'll join thanking you in this fascinating talk. I must admit I'm a bit new to the debate between cognitive load and productive failure. I'm wondering, for me it's so clear that what is going on has to do with emotions and motivations. When you fail, you want to know how to succeed, etc. I'm wondering why the whole debate, at least as I'm hearing here, is on the cognitive aspects, when it's so clear that there is so much affective aspect in productive failure.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there is an affective component. Motivation is part of it. Some aspects of affects have been studied, like interest, goal orientation. Others, not so much, like motivation. So yeah, there's a whole body of research. Like, if somebody wants to do that, it's definitely one of the mechanisms. Like I said, not all the mechanisms have been unpacked. Motivation and some of the affect and other mechanisms as well. Like I mentioned, embodied mechanisms are also things that we need to develop. So you're right. Well, yeah.
Hi. More recently, there's been quite a bit of work on the effect of like surprise and curiosity on learning. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how this might link to the work on productive failure.
Yeah. So yes, so there is work that if you get a prediction wrong, and then like so, I'm forgetting the name. Gavin Broad, are you here by any chance? He's not here, right? So if you're referring to that work, yes, he actually visited with my lab, and we had some very interesting conversations around the role of surprise when you fail at a prediction, and then you see the right phenomena, and then what that does. Yeah, so there's definitely some connection there.
So do you think the mechanisms might be similar or related?
I think it could be related. It could be one of the mechanisms, definitely, but at what time scale, I don't know yet. Oh, there is one question actually. Sorry. Are we really out of time or? Okay.
So I'm going to the very basic definition that you had about the productive failure. How important is the failure there? I understand the struggle is important. How important is that they actually fail? Or could it be that they struggle and succeed, and would that be equally productive?
We don't have we have that's a great question, and if you looked at some of the directions of future research, that was the first thing I asked, is failure necessary or sufficient, right? Now think about it, it's very hard to design such studies where, so there are two ways in which this could happen, right? And we're trying both ways. You give a complex problem, which is beyond the student. It could be that if you have large enough a sample, some students will somehow get to the correct solution. Some may get it at first, some may explore a little bit, then get it, right? So you'll have both process and outcome data there. And others may explore a lot and not get it at all, right? So you have a natural variation that provides the basis for us to ask the question, was it really failure to get to the correct, or is it something about the process, or is it really something getting to the correct solution, right? So again, finding that task or activity is hard to design, but maybe it can be done. And there is some past work where, especially in invention activities, the work of Dan Schwartz and Riddle Johnson and others, it hasn't been reported, but a lot of there is a lot of success in their invention activities. Okay, so if you can parse that data out, we can probably begin to analyze that. A second way in which we can investigate this issue is if you take, say, a productive failure task that is designed for students not to get to the correct answer, then you split them into two trajectories, broadly speaking. A, you support them to get to the correct answer. You explicitly scaffold for success. Or you keep them in the exploratory zone by getting them, even if they move towards the correct answer, you give them something incorrect, right? And we are actually, my student, Tanmay, is actually doing that kind of research right now. But that's a great question, and we need to interrogate that. But I'm not sold necessarily to the idea that failure is necessary. Yeah. Okay, there's another question now.
Last question.
So, how it is related with cognitive conflict? Is it the same idea?
Well, conflict is one of the things that happens, both when people are working with multiple ideas, but it's not the only thing that's happened. There are multiple mechanisms. So conflict could be one of the mechanisms. And when you're comparing and contrasting things, that's probably one of the things that happens. Conflict also happens when you see the correct solution, and you from the teacher. And as long as the teacher does a good job at directing attention, those are exactly those processes could be. Now, again, we can use different labels, but sometimes the mechanisms can be called differently. I grant you that.